Welcome to the beautiful Skagit River Valley, one of the most pristine, pastoral, and fertile valleys in North America, surrounded on three sides by the wild grandeur of the North Cascades Range. We invite you to listen and learn about the magnificent Skagit Valley.
When you are finished with the Celebrate Skagit audio tour, please return the CD to a distribution site or pass it along to someone else to use. That way others can enjoy the presentation. A list of convenient distribution and drop-off sites can be found on the CD jacket.
Also on the jacket, you'll find a map with location numbers that correspond directly to tracks on the CD. The tour begins on the east side of the Skagit Valley at New Halem, following scenic Highway 20 west to Deception Pass. You can begin the tour at any point.
We'll also point out a number of side trips you may want to take today or at a later time.
Now let's begin our tour. Completed in 1972, the North Cascades Highway is one of the most scenic highways in the Northwest. The section of the highway between Ross Dam Trailhead and Early Winters Resort near Mazama is usually closed from October through March due to avalanches and heavy snow. When the passes are open, travelers can view many waterfalls, jagged mountain peaks, and the three man-made dams. It takes approximately 2 hours by car to cross the North Cascades Range from Mazama to Marble Mount and another hour and a half to get to Deception Pass.
The North Cascades Highway takes you through one of the wildest, most biologically diverse ecosystems in North America. When the moisture-laden storms moving in from the Pacific Ocean meet the Cascades, the air rises and cools. The temperature drops, and the water falls as rain or snow. The average annual rainfall on the west side of the Cascades is 110 inches. The winter season may find as much as 46 feet of snow at elevations as low as 5,000 feet.
Snow often falls from September and lasts well into the next summer. This nourishment makes this lush rainforest home to hundreds of species of wildlife. There are 174 bird species, 73 mammals, 17 amphibians, and 10 reptiles residing in the Skagit watershed, including mountain goats, flying squirrels, marmots, bats, black bear, cougars, several species of hawks, bald eagles, wolverines, snowshoe hares, and pine white butterflies and dragonflies.
Great blue heron, beaver, white-tailed deer, and Roosevelt elk, harbor seals, sea otters, and orca whales join the list as you head further down valley. The Skagit River Delta is the wintering home of the largest population in the United States of migrating trumpeter swans and snow geese. Each year, over 500,000 visitors come to the Skagit Valley for birdwatching, as it is a premier location for spotting a large variety of migrating waterfowl species. As you travel along the river east of the alluvial floodplain of the Skagit Flats, try to imagine how time has created the dramatic natural landscape you see all around you. Scientists tell us that millions of years ago, the North Cascade Mountains were slowly pushed up from the ocean floor by shifting tectonic plates. Deep within the earth, these plates pressed against one another, east and west. The jagged mountains jut up from near sea level at Marble Mount to nearly a mile up into the clouds. Most peaks found in the Washington section of the North Cascades are between 7,000 and 9,000 feet high. Many sea fossils and shells can be found at the tops of these peaks and all through these mountains, revealing an ancient past when land lay at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean.
Nature provided yet another force to shape this great range, in the form of three great ice ages. The last ice age took place less than 3 million years ago. Two great ice sheets, one moving from the northeast, the other from the southwest, met somewhere between Rockport and Concrete to form an ice lake that actually changed the direction of the Sauk and Suattle rivers, causing them to flow north into the mighty Skagit, rather than into the Snohomish River to the south.
You can still clearly see evidence of this ancient ice lake etched on the mountains located between these two town sites. There are more glaciers in this mountain range than in any other place in the continental United States.
It is the runoff from these glaciers, the snowpack, and the rain in winter that keep the river flowing strong and the valley fertile during the driest months of July and August. Dry seasons are not common in the Skagit watershed. One reason salmon and the great forests still thrive here.
Meandering through this rich 100-mile-long valley is the wild and scenic Skagit River. Thundering through the area long before the mountains were formed, the Skagit connects the lesser populated communities upriver to the more densely populated flats of the river delta. Eventually, the river splits into a north and south fork around Fur Island, flowing westward into Skagit Bay, into the Puget Sound, and finally into the Pacific Ocean. The Skagit is one of the wildest and healthiest rivers in Washington, fed by nearly 3,000 creeks and tributaries. Within Washington state, the Skagit is the second only in volume to the mighty Columbia River and is the third largest river on the west coast. The Skagit River supplies 40% of the fresh water of the Puget Sound and is home to 40% of the area's salmon.
The magic Skagit is one of the only rivers in the Northwest with such an amazing balance of healthy and natural ecosystems. Flowing through the areas of wilderness, logging, agriculture, and industry, the river connects everyone and everything in the valley. The Skagit River was the first waterway in Washington to receive the status of wild and scenic river.
This means that it is to be kept as close to its natural state as possible. No new housing can be built close to the river, no permanent structures can be built along it, and no new docks or boathouses are allowed. The hope is to provide as pristine a setting as possible for visitors traveling on or close to the river, and a healthy living environment for the wildlife that depends on it for its survival. The Skagit River is home to 5 kinds of salmon: king, pink, chum, coho, and chinook, and 2 kinds of trout, including record-sized steelhead.
Steelhead Park at Rockport is famous for its excellent steelhead fishing. The upper Skagit Valley is also habitat to one of the largest wintering populations of bald eagles in the contiguous United States. In winter, the upper Skagit River is home to between 300 and 600 of these raptors. Sometimes as many as 30 to 70 birds can be seen sitting in a single tree along the river searching for their daily meal of fresh salmon. During the first weekend of February, the 3 upriver towns host a festival in honor of the bald eagles, featuring eagle viewing, educational workshops, arts and crafts, food, Native American storytelling, music, and culture. The Native American people have lived in the Puget Sound region for the last 11,000 to 12,000 years, and here in the Skagit River Basin for over 8,400 years, compared to the European Americans who arrived less than 300 years ago. The tribes often named themselves after the valleys they lived in, as in the Skagit, Suattle, Sauk, and Swinomish. They lived for many generations in the mountains and along the river, dependent upon the abundance or scarcity of the plants and animals in a landscape vulnerable to harsh changes. The first identified tribal settlements in this area were on the western shores of the Puget Sound, around Whidbey, Camano, and Samish Islands. As time passed, small bands of peaceful Skagit Indians left the shores of the Puget Sound to hide in the wilderness of the Eastern Valley foothills, away from attacking tribes from the north. As a matter of fact, the tribal word Skagit, from which the river and valley get their names, means to hide away. The early tribal people moved around the watershed in rhythm with the seasons, gathering food and resources. They depended upon the salmon for food and the great western red cedar for shelter and clothing. Even today, the modern Upper Skagit Indians fish for salmon and honor the importance of cedar in their heritage.
The river was a natural highway for the Upper Skagit people and an ancient trading route to the high deserts east of the mountains, enabling them to share locally abundant resources for the materials they lacked. For example, western red cedar bark and dried salmon were traded for the long grasses from the eastern plains to make baskets. When the first white explorers ventured into the Skagit Valley Basin, they counted approximately 11 different tribes. Today, there are 8 tribal communities in Skagit County. The first recorded venture into the Skagit Valley by white men was led by Captain George Vancouver. Records show that in 1792 he explored the Ross Lake area in hopes of finding an overland passage connecting east to west. Spanish explorers soon followed, discovering Samish Island. Peter Puget and Joseph Woodby came a year later, landing between Skagit Bay and Padilla Bay, which they described as a great sand flat with 3 feet of water on it. Then came the map makers, surveyors, and trappers. The first known white settlement in the Skagit area was on Woodby Island in 1850. The first trail was cut along the Skagit River in 1852.
Early pioneers were drawn to this area for its abundance in natural resources and land. Mining, logging, and agriculture were the area's first industries. Some miners may have stumbled on the valley while on the way to the Great Klondike Gold Rush in Alaska. California gold was running low when gold was discovered on the east of the mountains in Yakima Valley in 1853.
The sudden rush of prospectors into the area caused some conflict with the native peoples until gold was discovered along Canada's Fraser River in 1857. Then the droves of strange white men moved across the mountains and up the coast towards British Columbia. Legend has it that over 10,000 prospectors were camped out at Bellingham Bay in 1858, trying to get to that new source of the Yellow Goddess. The miners had heard the rumors. The further north you go, the more gold's to be had. These hardy miners were the first white people to explore the valley past the Great Log Jams.
Starting in 1850, settlers gradually left the densely forested shores of Puget Sound and made their way up the river valley by foot or by canoe. The second gold rush of 1880 brought another wave of prospectors and miners into the Cascade Mountains. Gold was struck on Ruby Creek, off the east end of Ross Lake. Ruby Creek City, a flash-in-the-pan town, sprang up at the end of the creek to support the miners for the relatively short life of the mine's success. Several good mines were discovered in the area, some boasting profits as much as $120,000 for the first 2 years. The news of the gold strike spread like wildfire. Hordes of miners from Canada and the lower 48 states swarmed into these mountains for the next 30 years. Most mining claims, however, were abandoned by the early 1890s, since there just wasn't enough profit to make the effort worthwhile. All in all, the average $10 spent to mine a claim brought an average $1 profit. So the glory and hope of certain treasures soon faded. Though many of these hopeful men left the area broke, a few managed to establish themselves and their families on homesteads carved out of the dense forest, thanks to the Homestead Act of 1862. The town of Ruby Creek now lies below Ross Lake, close to the bottom of Ross Dam.
Logging began in earnest in Skagit Valley in 1867, as the loss of timber on the east coast in Appalachia and in the Smoky Mountains became more severe. The giant red cedar, western hemlock, spruce, and broadleaf maple covering the river valley attracted the people from poverty-stricken parts of Virginia and North Carolina. Nicknamed Tar Heels, they were mostly of Irish and English ancestry. They came to the abundant Northwest, where work was plentiful. These new upriver residents gained a reputation for their skills at distilling moonshine during a time when most other towns in the country were dry. Government timber claims allowed settlers to live on the land as long as they developed it for its timber use. The boom began when the clearing of the great forests for homes and farmlands, and soon developed into a very profitable enterprise. In the 1870s, settlers from Wisconsin, Maine, and Minnesota brought in the specialized tools of the timber trade. As the Skagit River log jams were cleared, sawmills and logging camps pushed further east into the mountains. This seemingly endless supply of giant trees was energetically harvested, first by handsaw and oxen teams, and later by gas-powered saws and trucks. Some of these old-growth firs, which were among the largest trees in the world at that time, were over 1,000 years old. Using only manual saws, the fastest cutters could take down 4 huge trees a day. Some had stumps large enough to hold 4 couples during a square dance, measuring over 76 feet in circumference. Others were sometimes used as a small classroom on a sunny day. By the early 20th century, logging was going strong and the giant trees were falling fast. To be man, it was said, was to be a logger.
Consider how this expansion affected the Native Americans of the upper Skagit and the Sauk rivers. They were first invaded by prospectors with their mule teams in the late 1870s and 80s, and later by adventurous pioneers and loggers seeking fortunes or freedom, as the case may be. When the new young governor of Washington Territory, Isaac Stevens, negotiated the Point Elliott Treaty with the Indians in 1855, the native people were asked to give up their territories and move on to reservations in exchange for promises, many of which were not kept. The free-spirited tribes of the upper Skagit and Sauk did not sign the treaty and so continued to live in the region. Since a large smallpox epidemic killed many of their members in the 1930s, the tribes made an effort to preserve as much of their culture as possible and lived and worked peacefully alongside the arriving white settlers. In 1918, Seattle City Light established the towns of New Halem and Diablo to house the families of the employees who were building and operating the utility's Skagit Hydroelectric Project, consisting of the impressive Gorge, Diablo, and Ross dams and their powerhouses. This project, with its 2 unique company towns, extends 40 miles along the Skagit River to the Canadian border. The construction lasted 50 years, and now the towns are home to about 70 people who are employed in facility operations and maintenance. Ross Dam and its lake are named after the visionary J.D. Ross, whose dreams of supplying public power became a reality. Those huge power poles dissecting the valley on the way to Seattle were built in 1924 and still operate at full capacity, traveling from the powerhouses to the city in only 1 second. Mr. Ross and his wife Alice are interred in a crypt carved into the hillside on the north side of the highway, at the very east end of the town of New Halem. On the same end of town, there's a narrow suspension footbridge that leads to the right and behind the Art Deco-looking Gorge powerhouse. The trail winds upward through native plant gardens to picturesque Ladder Creek Falls. At night, the whole area is dramatically lit by an array of colored lights.
Seattle City Light offers several summer tours on the emerald waters of Diablo Lake to the great powerhouse at the foot of Ross Dam. Visitors can also enjoy a walking tour of Diablo and a ride up the dam on a rail car elevator. Trails abound to Pyramid Lake and Sourdough Mountain. The world-famous North Cascades Institute is stationed on the northern shores of Diablo Lake. A mile-long hike down the trail to Ross Dam will lead you to the floating Ross Lake Resort. As you travel past these 3 beautiful reservoirs, notice the distinctive colors of each lake. Gorge Lake is turquoise, Diablo Lake is jade-colored, and Ross Lake is teal. The colors are caused by finely ground mineral dust suspended in the water, reflecting the greens of the forest and the blue colors of the sky. Ancient forests, wildlife, and cascading waterfalls abound as you explore the North Cascades.
The North Cascades National Park Visitors Center, located just west of New Halem across a one-lane bridge, provides guided walks and information about hiking, camping, and other activities in the park. This region also offers access to the Ross Lake National Recreation Area. The North Cascades Highway closes at Ross Lake Trailhead in the winter and reopens in the spring. Let's go back in time now to a bright spring morning in 1897, when a hopeful pack train leaves the safety and shelter of Marble Mount and heads for the gold mines at Ruby Creek.
The going starts to get tough, taking the mule train 2 whole days just to travel the 14 miles up to the flats, now the site of the hydro village of New Halem, to the beginning of the dangerous Goat Trail, where the wild gorge of the Skagit begins. Will Jenkins writes in The Last Frontier in the North Cascades.
Where you entered the gorge, you followed about 200 feet of what stretched out as evidence of an early-day contractor's hopelessly abandoned attempt to build a road. This piece of road was about 8 feet wide. It ended abruptly against the foot of a mammoth rock slide, and some of the chunks of granite that had rolled down from the high escarpments of the Cascades were as big as boxcars. Here began the path Ruby Creek's early prospectors had dubbed the Goat Trail. It twisted and staggered among those mammoth chunks of broken rock in a tortuous route under overhanging snowfields that frequently set down tons of avalanching ice, rock, and trees to roar into the foaming Skagit. The trail ended here. It dipped sternly there. It turned sharply among the boulders no human could move, and in many places below and above the sheer igneous face known as Devil's Corner, the trail was so constricted between the rocks there was barely enough room for a mule to pass.
Today you can drive along this old goat trail as you journey the 6 miles down the highway from Diablo to New Halem. It appears as an empty riverbed with huge boulders and deep jagged ponds. But don't attempt to explore the dry river bottom. It is often used as a spillway for excess water being released from the gorge dam above, and in an instant a huge wall of water can change the whole scene.
Marble Mount marks the place where the ancient trading route leaves the Skagit River path, crosses the river, and follows the rugged Cascade River east, up to the pass and over the mountains to Stehekin at the west end of Lake Chelan on the east side of the state. This was the route first proposed to connect the east and west sides of the mountains, but funds for the route, to be called Highway 1, were held up by the start of World War II. Hugging the banks of the Skagit River, Marble Mount was founded during the gold rush years of the 1890s. The town, starting as an outgrowth of a trading post, thrived as an active supply, rest, and entertainment spot for the growing number of miners, surveyors, and explorers traversing the narrowing slopes of the valley. Marble Mount soon became a base camp for prospectors, leading long pack trains of horses or mules, some seeking silver in the mountains up above the Cascade River and its tributaries.
But most of these miners headed up towards the Skagit River's headwaters, pursuing fortunes of gold at Ruby Creek, the Skagit Queen, and other claims. Marble Mount was a huge rest after weeks of treacherous climbing and long, lonely nights on the trail.
Before you leave Marble Mount, be sure to visit the Marble Mount Fish Hatchery, one of the largest rearing ponds for thousands of king, silver, and chum salmon. Also, stop by the North Cascades National Park Service off Ranger Station Road just west of town, where you'll find maps and suggestions for day hikes, biking, fishing, campgrounds, and points of interest along this magnificent scenic highway.
By the end of the 19th century, the Great Northern Railway finally reached Rockport, so named by that railroad company. Transportation and delivering supplies beyond that point continued to be very difficult. This was still trail country, with only a few miles of very bad roads and endless miles of dense old-growth timber stretching through the foothills to the glaciers of the North Cascade Range. Canoes or mule-pack trains were the reliable means of transportation. Backpacking their supplies to their homestead cabins was the pioneers' accepted way of life.
Many years before the town of Rockport was founded, the area was home to the Skagit tribe. Their villages were centered around their cedar longhouses. Some of these structures extended to over 1,000 feet in length. The longhouses provided shelter for sleeping, cooking, ceremonial dancing, and craft and tool making, all under one roof. They lived and prospered for thousands of years in this pristine and abundant wilderness.
Once the railroad came to Rockport, the town began to boom. Squatters came to stake their claims alongside miners seeking silver along the Cascade River or the promised fortune of gold at Ruby Creek. Next, shingle camps sprang up in the surrounding hills and helped keep the new town healthy. Along with the shingle mill, there were 2 butcher shops, several hotels and restaurants, 2 train depots, 3 stores, and even a mayonnaise factory. The Swedes, Norwegians, Irish, and the English began to explore further and further east into the lush and fertile valley. These loggers cut the timber along the rivers and floated it down to the mills. Then came the shingle weavers and later the Italians and Greeks to work down in the cement plants at Concrete. Will Jenkins writes of Rockport.
In 1915, Rockport was a quiet place spread out in unplanned looseness, where honeybees droned among cottage rose bushes and warm summer winds rustled the big cottonwoods along the river, where the aroma of frying chicken drifted from open kitchen doors and the loudest noise was the rumble of squeaking horse-drawn wagons on the rocky natural earth that was Rockport's main street. Twice a day, Rockport stirred with a brief burst of activity at the depot, in the early morning departure of the train and its evening return.
The Skagit River bustled with commerce up and down the river during the time of the early settlers. There were once up to 16 ferries on the river. In 1962, the last ferry ended its run on the river. It is now on display in Howard Miller Steelhead Park. Indian canoes delivered most of the groceries and supplies to the booming settlement of Rockport at the turn of the century. A canoe trip from the nearest trading post at Hamilton took about 2 days to reach Rockport, compared to the 25 minutes it takes today.
Heading out of Rockport, you'll see Sauk Mountain rising up over 5,000 feet to the west. The local tribal people claimed this as a holy mountain where their young men would climb up to experience a time of meditation and reflection as they waited to receive their animal spirit.
Legend also has it that there still exists today a sizable dwelling of Sasquatch, Bigfoot as some call them, at the foot of Sauk Mountain, and all through the North Cascades. The native people say that you can sometimes hear their high-pitched whistles if you listen closely. An 8-mile gravel road, Forest Service Road 1030, leads up to the trailhead parking lot, where you can continue to the top via a well-maintained switchback trail. It's a moderate 2-hour hike that is well worth the trip, not only for the visitors you meet from all over the world, but because you can see a grand view of the North Cascades, the Sauk Valley to the south, and the magnificent Olympic Mountains, Puget Sound, and the San Juan Islands to the west. The primitive road takes off to the north of Highway 20 at milepost 96. At the base of Sauk Mountain is a 670-acre Rockport State Park, containing beautifully preserved stands of virgin old-growth cedar, hemlock, and fir trees. This pristine setting among the ancient old-growth forest provides tent, group, and RV camping, picnicking, and 5 miles of leisurely hikes for the curious traveler.
In 1874, Several prospectors, including Amasa Everett, stopped near the site of Hamilton to look into a story an Indian told them about a black rock in great supply in the hills on the south bank of the river. Coal, they were sure. It was during this trip that Everett broke his leg, it became infected, and it had to be amputated. This didn't stop Pegleg, as he was later called, from continuing to explore further upriver all the way to Marble until finally settling back at the mouth of the Baker River where Concrete is now located.
About a year later, Everett, returning from the unsuccessful trip further upriver in search of gold and silver, discovered limestone and clay, two key components of cement, in the hills on the eastern bank of the Baker River, and sold it to an enterprising cement company. Financiers in New York provided the backing, and the Washington-Portland Cement Company was formed. In 1905, a quarry was dug just above the town, and a cement processing plant was built. The East Bank community surrounding the plant was called Cement City. A second plant provided much of the building materials for the three large Seattle City Light dams. The old storage towers still stand on both sides of the river. Settlement along the Skagit was a risky business. One problem was that while settlers were encouraged to develop the land, the government had claims to some parcels that were not always easy to locate. In a 1982 interview, 93-year-old Will Jenkins described how his family acquired their land by a process called proving up.
There were two ways to prove up. You could live on it for 3 years, and the government said they promised they would give you a patent to it, or you could prove up in 14 months by paying it was $2.25 an acre, which is a little faster, but if you had the money, that was one way to get out. But we chose to live on the claim. My mother didn't have that kind of money, and nobody else did in our neighborhood.
In the early part of the 20th century, controversy stirred as the loggers and homesteaders learned that industrialists were promoting the construction of dams in the Skagit River Basin. In 1917, Seattle City Light Superintendent James D. Ross convinced the city of Seattle to obtain permits for building the dams on the Skagit River. The construction of the three large dams brought a new influx of workers. Power generation continues to provide jobs for many Upper Skagit residents today. Concrete experienced its second big boom between 1923 to 1926 when the Baker River Dam was under construction. In fact, over half of the cement used in building the much larger Grand Coulee Dam in central Washington came from concrete. The town's heritage is celebrated in August at Cascade Days, and a Saturday market shows its colorful wares each week at the old train station along the highway from May to September. Leaving Concrete, notice the meadow on the south side of the highway between mileposts 85 and 86. During either dawn or dusk, there's a good chance you'll see a large herd of Roosevelt elk.
The settlement of Birdsview was formed alongside the Skagit River in 1878. The community was established along Grandy Creek. B.D. Birdsey Minkler built a water-powered sawmill on the opposite bank of the river and started shipping lumber to the growing communities of Burlington and Mount Vernon. Minkler chartered the area's first post office in 1885, and Birdsview was named in his honor. A ferry crossing was established between Minkler's Landing and Birdsview, and the two settlements became the eastern port of the stern-wheelers that brought business and supplies to the upriver frontier towns. Because Birdsview was never platted, it could not become an official town. Instead, it remains today a pastoral collection of country homes and farmlands. Just a few years ago, Birdsview received national attention when a gold discovery was made on the south side of the river that was estimated to be worth roughly $2.4 billion. North from Birdsview, the Baker Lake Road allows access to the glaciers of Mount Baker, Mount Shuckson, and the recreation on Baker Lake. Hiking trails, campgrounds, resorts, fishing, boating, swimming, snow parks, and hot springs are all just a few miles north of Birdsview.
The Upper Skagit area remained undeveloped decades after the settlement of the lower river due to three impenetrable log jams. These massive obstacles stretched for 2 miles on the lower Skagit River, prohibiting navigation upriver. The logjam was finally removed by dynamite in 1879. In 1867, William Hamilton was the first white man to file claim for land on the upriver side of the logjam. Amazingly, during this time, one of the Indian settlements just above the logjam had more than 500 members. Most of today's modern communities are still built on the sites of old Indian villages. The towns of Hamilton and Lyman were settled during the 1880s and 90s. The town of Hamilton sprang up when iron ore and coal were discovered in the surrounding area. Promoters seeking East Coast money claimed that Hamilton was the Pittsburgh of the West. The new town promised to boom in steel and iron. With a mountain of coal and another of iron sitting just across the river, residents anticipated great fortune and long-lasting prosperity for those who arrived early. But the big money never appeared. The promoters left and the town stayed small. A giant alluvial or underground floodplain meanders through the Lyman-Hamilton area. Through the centuries, frequent floods built up the prolific farmland with deposits of silt and sand. Today, such flooding puts the town of Hamilton in harm's way when the fall and winter rains combine with snowpack runoff. It keeps the place from getting overcrowded, the locals say. As you approach Lyman, watch for the migrating herd of elk that seasonally move across the valley in this area at dawn and dusk. The valley begins to widen as you drive through the Lyman area. The first settler to homestead the area was A.R. Williamson in 1871. After that, others followed and gradually moved farther upriver.
Just 5 miles east of Interstate 5 along Highway 20 is the gateway to the North Cascades, Sedro-Woolley. Mortimer Cook, an early explorer to the area, staked a claim on 34 acres near the riverbank in 1884. Mr. Cook called the settlement Bug, in deference to the numerous mosquitoes along the river during the springtime. Some of the ladies in the new settlement protested and changed the name to Cedra, the Spanish word for cedar, but unfortunately misspelled it, so the name Sedro stuck. The name became Sedro-Woolley after Sedro moved north to higher ground because of constant flooding and merged with another small town close by named Woolley. The second town, named after its founder Philip Woolley, was known for the sawmill he set up to accommodate the town's logging operation. Sedro-Woolley still celebrates the past with murals that line the town's main street depicting early scenes of logging, railroads, and farming. During the Founders' Day celebration, a famous 1914 bank robbery is reenacted on the streets, pleasing young and old alike. The town also hosts an old-fashioned logger rodeo on the 4th of July weekend.
In 1882, a logging camp was set up by John F. Millett and William McKay. Millett, McKay, T.J. Wilson, and Thomas Soles laid out the town of Burlington in 1889. Soles named the town Burlington after his hometown of Burlington, Vermont.
Burlington was not much more than a stump town with a little mountain to the north. However, an influx of people changed its status to that of a small town within 10 years. Burlington's first school district was formed in 1891, and Burlington was incorporated in 1902. A logging road was built in 1883 to connect Burlington to the river, so logs could be sent to the mills. Cedar shingles were hauled by the Northern Pacific Railroad to Seattle and Tacoma, from where they were transported all over the country, but mostly to the Great Plains, as there was no lumber there. By 1890, most of the land close to the Skagit River in Burlington and Mount Vernon had been logged.
Looking forward to other economic opportunities, H.L. Boehmer, in the June 1, 1899 edition of the Burlington Journal newspaper, saw the Great Northern Railroad as the means to accommodate the shipping, trading of agricultural products. The Great Northern moved their Belleville depot station to Burlington overnight, much to the surprise of the local Bellevue residents. By 1910, Burlington could boast of shingle manufacturing, dairy and poultry farming, fruit trees, 7 churches, a high school and a grade school, electric lights, a weekly newspaper, volunteer fire department, a city park, and the county fair. In 1920, Burlington started a dairymen's association and built a plant to turn milk into butter, cream, powdered milk, and ice cream mix. The Burlington Canning Company canned and sold locally grown berries, fruit, and vegetables. It also sent canned jams into the national market. Another enterprise was performed by Knutson Brothers, who sold wagons, buggies, plows, and other farm equipment. Rich farms and farmland surrounding Burlington have added to its importance. In fact, until 1910, cows grazed freely on the streets of Burlington, each with its own distinctive sounding bell so the owners would know where to find their cows for milking time each evening. In 1910, a city ordinance in the growing town of 1,400 people barred cows from roaming the streets.
Burlington has long seen itself as an economic center for Skagit County. In fact, it refers to itself as the hub city, initially due to being a railway crossroad, not as a major retailing area. One of its favorite festivals is the Berry Dairy Days, held in mid-July each year.
The largest city in Skagit County is Mount Vernon. It sits midway between Seattle and Vancouver, BC. It hosts the annual Tulip Festival Street Fair in mid-April during the month-long Skagit Valley Tulip Festival. Another popular annual event during April is the Kiwanis Salmon Barbecue, held in the city's historic Hillcrest Lodge. In 1997, American Demographics named Mount Vernon the best small city in the nation, ahead of nearly 200 cities with populations between 15,000 to 50,000. Mount Vernon has the honor of serving as the seat of Skagit County government. The first Skagit County courthouse was built in 1893 at First and Pine. It was purchased and still used by the descendants of the Matheson family. Mount Vernon hosts the 700-seat McIntyre Hall Performing Arts and Conference Center, the historic Lincoln Theater, the Skagit Valley Highland Games each July, and the Western Washington Shakespeare Festival each August.
The area was first homestead in the 1870s. The town was named after George Washington's home. From 1876 to 1879, local loggers used their tools and strength to break up a 2-mile logjam on the Skagit River. Once this was accomplished, the river could be used for transportation and the town grew rapidly. Another early accomplishment was building the first wagon bridge across the Skagit River at Mount Vernon. It was completed in the early 1890s. In the early 1900s, the residents of Mount Vernon voted to outlaw saloons in their towns. There were many disagreements between Burlington and Mount Vernon residents during temperance times. Mount Vernon was dry and Burlington was wet, so people would travel by train on Saturday nights to visit the social establishments of Burlington. The cost of a train ticket was just 10 cents. In one weekend in 1911, however, Mount Vernon railway ticket sales reached $700. The Great Northern Railway attracted other railroads to the area. Mount Vernon contributed 100 acres so the right way and station and line would go through the town. This turned out to be a wise decision because when the railroad and river traffic met, the town exploded with life.
Other transportation items to note are that State Route 536 between Mount Vernon and Anacortes was named Memorial Highway in honor of the Armed Forces personnel who served during World War I. In 2004, Mount Vernon completed Skagit Station, a multimodal center that serves the area by bringing together passenger train, local and long-distance bus, airport shuttle, and taxi services. Conway was a stopping point for the steamers headed to Fur Island before the coming of the Great Northern Railway. The town began to grow due to the commerce brought in by the railway, so by 1914 a bridge replaced the ferry across the South Fork of the Skagit River, and it became the outlet for Fur Island and areas south of Skagit County. Today Conway boasts several outstanding antique shops. A boat launch for smaller craft at Conway Park allows access to the South Fork of the Skagit.
In 1863, Samuel Calhoun was working in a lumber mill across the Skagit Bay from the mouth of the North Fork of the Skagit River. Calhoun was curious to see the area of the Skagit, so hired an Indian guide to take him across the bay in a canoe. Calhoun wrote that the trees were so thick that he had to climb a tree in order to get a good look at the river's edge, the marshes, and the sloughs. He was able to see large areas of marshy ground free of trees. He noticed that the forests were on higher ground and the salt flats were towards the sea. Calhoun returned with seeds, planted a garden, and built a cabin in an area he named Pleasant Ridge, just east of what is now LaConner. Calhoun and his farming neighbor Michael Sullivan were familiar with building dikes on this type of land. Together they started digging the tide flat dikes by hand with shovel and wheelbarrows. By 1876, 2,000 acres of tide flats were being farmed for growing oats and raising livestock. In the 1870s, frequent winter flooding threatened the settlers' farms and homes. They united to dig by hand many miles of earthen dikes. Many of these dikes are still maintained today and save the towns along the river from devastating floods.
The Skagit Flats and Skagit River Delta boast some of the most fertile farmlands in the world. The River Delta floodplain extends northward from Skagit Bay to the east side of the Swinomish Channel, up through Padilla Bay, and continues on to Samish Bay in the northern part of Skagit County. In the distant past, this was a large area of islands, filled in with silt from the deltas of both the Skagit and the Samish rivers. Today, agriculture is the #1 industry in Skagit County. In all, over 80 crops are grown in the Skagit Valley, including 95% of the red potatoes grown in Washington State. About 50% of the world's production of spinach, beet, cabbage, and Brussels sprout seeds are from the Skagit Valley. Farming contributes over $600 million annually to the local economy from crops, livestock, and dairy products grown on 93,000 acres of land. These farmers of the Skagit Flats are the 4th and 5th generation descendants of the early settlers. There are over 700 generation farms remaining today. The current threat to agriculture in the Skagit Valley is the growing pressure of urban sprawl into valuable, rich farmland. A concerted community effort is being led by grassroots organizations such as Skagitonians to preserve farmland, to protect farming and farmland in this incredibly abundant floodplain area. The Skagit Valley has many natural advantages that create idyllic growing conditions such as the temperate and moist Pacific Northwest climate, the glacier sediment and volcanic soil deposited over the centuries by the floodwaters of the Skagit River, plus sub-irrigated soil on the floodplain. This means that the water table is very high in this area, and it is rare that the farmland needs to be irrigated in the summer months, unlike the drier farmland east of the mountains. All of these factors combine to produce a fertile and abundant landscape that the farmers call the Magic Skagit.
The valley is home to a diverse community of people who come from many parts of the world. Much of its diversity is due to Latin American farm workers who come here for seasonal work from June through November, skillfully working with berries, cucumbers, potatoes, flowers, and other crops. While many field workers continue to follow harvests to California, eastern Washington, or Texas, others have made a permanent home for themselves and their families in the Skagit Valley. adding their rich heritage to the cultural tapestry of the area.
In 1867, a trading post opened across from the Swinomish Indian Reservation to service the Indians and the local farmers who were diking the area. In 1869, John Connor bought the trading post and renamed the place Le Connor after his wife, Louisa A. Connor. By 1873, James and George Gatchis opened a store in Le Connor, and the state's first newspaper, the Puget Sound Mail, moved from Bellingham to Le Connor. Soon the railroads bypassed Le Connor and went through Mount Vernon and Burlington. Commercial development followed the railroads, and Le Connor became one of the major farming and seed-growing areas of the county.
In 1906, Mary Brown Stewart started growing tulips with bulbs brought from Holland. Now over 1,000 acres of Skagit farmland is used to grow many varieties of tulips and daffodils. Le Connor is the center of an annual tulip festival during the month of April that brings more than 1 million people to the valley. Daffodils, too, are grown here, and the bright yellow flowers can be seen from March until May. Irises end the blooming season in May, making Le Connor a photographer's haven. Le Connor is the home of the Skagit County Historical Museum, the sponsor of this Celebrate Skagit audio tour you are listening to. The Historical Museum boasts a permanent turn-of-the-century display and is located at the top of the hill on South 4th Street. We hope you'll stop by to visit their exhibits when you visit this picturesque former fishing village. Le Connor is also famous for its quaint turn-of-the-century shops and the Museum of Northwest Art.
Many believe that Bayview Ridge, Bow Hill, and the Samish River Flats and Valley were settled by groups of the Upper Samish tribe who spoke the Upper Skagit Nisqually group of languages. These people were known as fishers and root gatherers. Past tribal leader Chief Sampson, however, claims that these people were not Upper Samish in name at all, but were the warlike Nuwahas. The Nuwahas were strongly influenced by the Thunderbird and Wolf totems. At their zenith, before being devastated by European diseases, they raided as far south as Puyallup and as far west as Vancouver Island. This tribal group only became peaceful when converted to Catholicism by early pioneer priests traveling with the Hudson's Bay Company and operating out of Fort Nisqually. Before the Nuwahas stopped warring, however, they had a fortification at the mouth of Edison Creek to stop invaders from the north. But by the 1830s, the Nuwahas and other tribes in the area could not defeat European diseases such as smallpox. When smallpox swept through the villages, 800 out of 1,000 indigenous people died. In 1890, yet another smallpox epidemic swept the area. Scores of Indians died, and the pioneer settlers were afraid to go into the forest as corpses lay rotting among the trees or were found floating down the rivers. Body hunters were finally hired to locate and bury the dead. Sadly, no trace remains of the many large longhouses in the Padilla Bay area. Today, there are no visible indications of the bustling Native American culture that once inhabited the Bayview area. After the Point Elliott Treaty, Native American culture disappeared from Bayview Ridge and over the lower Skagit Valley. Many moved on to the Swinomish Reservation, homesteaded, or became the Pacific Northwest's first migrant labor for logging, fishing, and farming. Canoes were the primary means of transportation for the various tribal people until the 1920s. Even after the resettlement on the Swinomish Reservation, many former residents of the Bayview area returned to fish for herring or salmon and dig for clams in the beautiful beds out on the bay. The Indians stopped coming after the village of Bayview burned.
The first Anglo family home in Bayview was built in 1873. by R.E. Whitney. The Whitney Railroad Station was named after him, and you can still see the old Whitney Railroad sign as you pass by on Highway 20. So the people came to the Bayview area in the late 1880s. The federal government started a mail route in Skagit County and delivered twice a week. Bayview soon had a shingle mill, mercantile store, 11 logging camps, blacksmith shop, a school, a tailor shop, IOOF lodge, hotel, and a saloon. The town was booming by the early 1900s. The new roads to Bayview, Edison, and Samish Island freed the residents from depending on travel by steamboats, skiffs, and canoes. Bayview had its own railroad line, the Galloping Goose, that ran through this area and connected the residents to Burlington, to the east, and to the rest of the growing county. The logging boom started to go soft around 1909 as the lumber company had logged off most of the area, so they moved south towards Fredonia and to new stands of forests. In 1919, Prohibition came to Bayview. Stills producing 150 proof alcohol were operated all up and down the Skagit River, but in Bayview, beer and wine were most popular, selling for 50 cents a quart. Farmers came to grow oats, hay, barley, and hops on the fertile flatlands created by the earthen dikes along Padilla Bay. By 1923, the population of Bayview was 250 people. Today, the Padilla Bay Trail follows the dike for 2.5 miles. This gravel-top trail not only provides birdwatching and wildlife viewing opportunities, but recreation for walkers, joggers, bicyclists, and photographers.
Standing on top of the earthen dike and viewing firsthand the water level of the bay rise high above the level of the farmland on the other side of the dike is quite a marvel of man's ingenuity and work to reclaim the land from the sea. Many great plans for industrial parks were made for Bayview, but they never came to be. Only a few industrial sites were established in the area, including Rusima Brothers Boat Works, which started in 1955 and still operates today. Also, trucking manufacturer PACCAR located a multi-million-dollar technical center and state-of-the-art facility on Bayview Ridge off Farm to Market Road in 1981. The center tests both Peterbilt and Kenworth trucks on a 1.6-mile endurance test track. Each year during the Tulip Festival, PACCAR hosts an open house for visitors to see the many durability testing procedures conducted at the site.
Along the scenic Bayview Edison Road, you'll find the Padilla Bay Estuarine Research, Reserve, and Interpretive Center. Exhibits of wildlife, fish, and fowl found in the wetland area of Padilla Bay are open for public viewing, as well as videos shown in the theater and a hands-on exhibit area for children. The Swinomish Channel is 7.5 miles east of Anacortes, separating Fidalgo Island from the mainland. Before 1942, steamers could travel up the channel, but had to be careful not to run aground on shallow mud flats. Poles with flags were placed in the channel so a boat captain would know which way to quickly steer his vessel to avoid getting stuck in the mud or tree snags. The channel accommodated vessels of medium draft, but was obstructed at each end by extensive tide flats on low tide. In March of 1942, the Army Corps of Engineers allocated $16,000 to have the channel dredged and also constructed and repaired the dikes to maintain the channel through the tide flats. A high arching bridge now spans the channel. On a clear day when you reach the highest point of the arch, you can see the sweeping panorama of glaciers of Mount Baker, the North Cascades to the east, Mount Rainier to the south, and the snow-capped peaks of the Coast Range to the north.
Since Anacortes has one of the best deep-water ports on the west coast, Amos Bowman moved with his wife to the Ship Harbor area in 1876. Bowman established a post office and named the settlement after his wife, Anna Curtis. He started his own newspaper and led the effort to bring the Transcontinental Railway terminus to town. Bowman felt this was the perfect jumping-off point for trade with the Orient. His vision caught on, and at one time there were 5 rival railroad depots in town. The Transcontinental Railway, however, never came. San Francisco was chosen instead. Anacortes, nevertheless, did become an important railway center with the creation of the Interurban Railway in 1913. The Interurban could carry 88 passengers and travel up to 65 miles per hour. Traveling on the Great Northern Tracks, it ran from Anacortes to Burlington. There you could transfer on to Sedro-Woolley or to Fairhaven in Bellingham. At Sedro-Woolley you could transfer north to Canada or south to Seattle. The Interurban Railway ran until 1930, when automobiles became the transportation of choice. Anacortes has maintained its wealth through other resources, such as maritime services, fishing, and it is now a haven for boaters to discover the local waters in the San Juan Islands. On the westernmost end of Fidalgo Island lies Washington Park, a 220-acre park overlooking Rosario Strait. Washington Park has a 3-mile paved road that winds its way through remnants of old-growth forests. German-born pioneer Henry Havocost arrived at March's Point in 1871. Like Amos Bowman, he wanted to create a gateway from Anacortes to the Orient. He settled at Burroughs Bay on part of the land that he later donated to the city of Anacortes. Havocost wanted to leave a legacy to Anacortes, so he donated 8 acres of land to the city, which were incorporated into Washington Park. A monument in his honor stands in the park overlooking Burroughs Bay. The rest of the park was purchased by the Anacortes Women's Club in 1922. Currently, the city of Anacortes maintains the park along with its 75 campsites, boat launch, walking trails, picnic area, and playgrounds. Closer to town, you will pass Ship Harbor, where the Washington State ferries currently arrive and depart for the San Juan Islands. The first fish canneries built in the 1890s were also in this area of Anacortes. In the middle of Anacortes, 7th Street and M Avenue, is Causland Park. Harry Leon Causland, farmer and dairyman born on Guimas Island, died in France during World War I while resupplying ammunition to his outfit, which was surrounded by German gunfire. He was killed while carrying ammunition, saving his entire battalion. Causland is one of the 100 immortals in General John J. Pershing's Hall of Fame. The park was erected to honor Causland and 13 other local men from the surrounding islands who gave their lives in the Great War. An annual 4th of July celebration is held here along with weddings and local gatherings.
The Carnegie Library is kitty corner across the street from Causland Park. The library was opened Christmas Day 1910 as the first public library in Washington State. In 1968, the Anacortes Museum moved into the Carnegie Library and now houses Anacortes' memories, the research library, and its archives.
Driving along Fidalgo Bay to the east, you will see the 2 oil refineries built in the 1950s on March's Point. This area of Fidalgo Island was the first area to be inhabited by white settlers. At the first stoplight on Highway 20, turn right toward Deception Pass and Whidbey Island. From this turnoff, it is approximately 5 miles to the Deception Pass Bridge. As you head south on Highway 20, you will drive along the edge of Lake Campbell. Lake Campbell is a true rarity because the lake itself on an island has an island within the lake. You can see it from the highway. Also notice that Lake Campbell sits at the base of Mount Erie, a 1,300-foot peak that is just south of Anacortes. There is a paved road up the west side of Mount Erie that takes you all the way to the summit. From the top of Mount Erie, you will have a 360-degree panoramic view of all the local islands and the Skagit Flats. In the distance, you'll be able to spot the Olympic Mountains to the southwest, the Cascades Range to the northeast, and the Canadian Selkirk Mountains to the north. Just beyond Pass Lake, turn right if you'd like to view the Bowman Bay Civil Conservation Corps Interpretive Center. In the 1930s, the CCC boys, as they were called, were instrumental in building the roadway approaches and guardrails that led to the Deception Pass Bridge. The CCC boys also beautified areas of the local environment that include Deception Pass Park, Rosario Beach Park, and Cornet Bay Park. The Interpretive Center is only open through the spring and fall, but there are buildings, trails, and sheltered picnic areas that are accessible year-round. Driving back to Highway 20, turn right to continue to Deception Pass Bridge, and be aware of the guardrail, log, and rockery approaches hand-built by the dedicated CCC boys. During the Skagit Delta area's settlement, the most favorable means of transportation was by water. The mud flats and the running of the tide were formidable obstacles to travel. In 1907, Captain George Morris, an elected state representative, petitioned the legislature to build a bridge over the Deception Pass waterway. This bridge would connect Fidalgo Island to Whidbey Island. This undertaking seemed unlikely to most, so in 1913, a Deception Pass ferry service began, which took both vehicles and passengers across Deception Pass from Dewey Beach on Fidalgo Island to Coronet Bay on Whidbey Island.
In 1933, Representative Pearl Wanamaker sponsored a bill that would allow the state parks to build a toll bridge across the Deception Pass waterway. Instead, the bridge was made a Public Works Administration, or WPA, project when President Roosevelt granted funds for the bridge through his unemployment relief policies. Many local men were hired to help in the construction of the bridge. Work was started in August 1934, and the bridge was completed less than a year later in July under the direction of Lacey V. Murrell, director of the State Highway Department and brother to Edward R. Murrell, the famous broadcaster from Edison, Washington.
The bridge is 180 feet above the swirling waters of the Deception Pass Channel. The main span of the bridge was completed from both ends to finally meet in the middle. The entire bridge is 1,487 feet long and the roadway is 22 feet wide. For your safety, and for those that wish to walk across the bridge, there are vehicle pullouts and parking lots on both the Fidalgo and Whidbey Island sides of the bridge. Deception Pass is one of the most photographed bridges in the world, and to this day remains an engineering marvel.
We hope you enjoyed your travels along the wild and scenic North Cascades Highway and State Route 20. This CD was produced by participants in the 2005 Leadership Skagit program. Leadership Skagit is a non-profit program that brings together present and future leaders from across Skagit County to improve our communities and their way of life. We encourage you to return the CD to a convenient distribution point you'll find listed in the CD jacket cover, or share it with a friend. Thanks for joining us in the celebration of Skagit Valley. From the mountains to the sea, we believe it is a rare and special place. And now that you know a bit more about it, we hope you do too. Thanks for listening,